Tessa Aldrin pressed the elevator button with her elbow, balancing two coffee trays and trying not to drop the folder tucked under her chin when the doors slid open. She stepped inside, not noticing the gold plaque to the right of the panel that read, "Private Access Marlowe Executive Only." The elevator doors sealed shut behind her. She looked up confused. There were no floor numbers, just a sleek chrome panel with a single button glowing red. "Wait. What?" she mumbled, nudging the button with her elbow again. Nothing changed. The elevator began to rise.
Oh, no, no, no.
Please don't be one of those restricted. The doors opened into silence. Tessa stepped out slowly, heels clicking on black marble, and stared. The space was massive floor-to-ceiling windows revealing the Manhattan skyline, sleek furniture in rich leather tones, and a glass desk that looked like it belonged in a sci-fi movie. And behind that desk, a man in a tailored charcoal suit stood slowly, eyes narrowing. "Who are you?" His voice was deep, calm, but carried a warning. Tessa froze. I think I made a mistake. I was trying to get to the 22nd floor. I'm delivering coffee for the creative team at Northlight Media. He didn't answer, just walked around the desk and came closer, his intense gaze fixed on her. You used the private elevator, he said. It was open, she stammered. I didn't know it was private. He stopped a few feet from her, tall, broad-shouldered, and way too handsome for her brain to process. His dark, neatly styled hair and sharp jawline made him look like he walked out of a GQ cover shoot. My name's Tessa. Tessa Aldrin, she added quickly. I'm just interning. This is my first week. He nodded slowly. And you just wandered into the top floor of the building owned by me. Her stomach dropped. You're the owner? His mouth twitched. Farrow Marlowe.
Tessa.
Oh my God. She looked down at the coffee trays. Do you want one? I have extra. He stared at her for a long second, then broke into the smallest, almost reluctant grin. You're not going to get fired, he said. She looked up in surprise. You're terrified, he added. I'm not okay. Yes, a little. He took one of the coffee cups. You're brave to admit that.
Tessa blinked.
So, I can go. He didn't move. You're already here. Might as well sit. She hesitated. I don't bite, he added, walking back to his desk. Unless someone lies to me. Tessa took a seat in the chair across from him, carefully setting the coffee trays down. Her heart was pounding. She was supposed to be back downstairs in 5 minutes. She was supposed to avoid drawing any attention. And now she was stuck in the penthouse office of the millionaire CEO of the company. He sat down and studied her. You said your name is Tessa Aldrin? She nodded. You're an intern. Communications? Creative marketing. I just started Monday. He leaned back. So, you're the girl who redesigned the client pitch deck everyone's been talking about. Tessa's eyes widened. How do you know that? I read everything before it goes out. That was clean work. Clever copy. A flush crept up her neck. Thank you. I didn't think anyone would notice. I did. She tried to smile, but the air between them had shifted. He wasn't just some intimidating CEO anymore. He'd paid attention to her work. I should really get back downstairs, she said, standing. He stood too. I'll have someone escort you. That's not necessary. But he was already at the elevator, pressing a code into the panel. The doors opened, revealing the same chrome and glass interior. He turned back to her. You're curious, aren't you? About what? Why I let you stay? Tessa swallowed. I mean, yeah. Aren't you busy? I am. He stepped in front of the open doors. But something about you made me stop. She didn't know what to say to that. I'll see you again, Tessa Aldrin. She stepped inside the elevator, heart racing. That's supposed to be a threat? He smiled, genuine and quiet this time. Not unless you want it to be. The doors closed. Her knees buckled the moment she was alone, and she let out a breath. What just happened? 2 days later, a note showed up at her tiny desk. Come upstairs.
FM.
Tessa stared at it like it might explode. You okay? Her manager asked. Yeah, she said quickly, tucking the note away. Just caffeine jitters. She pressed the elevator button again. This time, it didn't open automatically. She waited, wondering if she was being tested. A few seconds later, a man in a black suit approached. Miss Aldrin? Mr. Marlowe is expecting you. He opened the private elevator with a keycard. Tessa stepped inside, palms clammy. When the doors opened, Farrow Marlowe was waiting, leaning against the desk like he had all the time in the world. You came. I didn't think I had a choice. You always have a choice, he said simply. But I hoped you'd choose to come. She stepped toward him. Why? He tilted his head. Because I've been thinking about you. And I don't usually think about people. Her heart beat louder. Is this professional? He gave her a look. Do you want it to be? I don't date my boss. I'm not your boss. You're the CEO. And you're an intern. Temporary. That ends in 6 weeks. Tessa stared at him. Are you seriously trying to plan a relationship around my internship and date? He walked closer. I'm just saying I'm not asking you to break any rules. I just want to know if you feel this too. She didn't answer. He stepped closer, voice lower. Because I haven't stopped thinking about the way you looked at me. Like you saw something I didn't even realize was showing. Maybe I did, she whispered. His jaw tightened slightly. Then don't pretend it didn't happen. She looked up at him. What do you want, Farrow? He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek.
Dinner.
Just dinner.
No strings. No elevator detours.
She hesitated.
Fine.
But I'm choosing the place. He grinned like she'd just given him the best news of his week. Deal. Dinner was at a small Italian spot in West Village. He showed up in a black button-down and no tie. Tessa wore a navy dress she'd borrowed from her roommate. Over pasta and wine, they talked about everything his childhood in Boston, her love of classic movies, the worst pitch meeting they'd both ever sat through. By dessert, she was laughing so hard she forgot to care who he was. I like this version of you, she said, sipping her wine. What version is that? The one who isn't terrifying. He leaned forward. You were never scared of me. That's what I like.
She paused.
Why me, though? Farrow reached across the table, his hand covering hers. Because you weren't supposed to be in that elevator. But you were. And I don't believe in accidents. Her heart flipped. The next few weeks blurred. More late-night dinners. Walks through Central Park. Quiet moments in his penthouse where he'd read her notes and ask questions about her ideas like they actually mattered. He bought her a sketchbook after she mentioned she used to draw. He had it personalized with her name in gold. One night, as they stood by the windows of his office, looking out over the city, he turned to her. I want more, Tessa. She looked up at him. More what? More of this.
You. Us.
I want all of it. She didn't hesitate. I do too. He kissed her, slow and deep, like he'd been waiting for that moment since the day she stepped into his elevator. And maybe, just maybe, he had. Tessa stared at the blinking cursor on her laptop screen, the words of her campaign proposal refusing to line up the way they had in her head. The open office buzzed with low conversation, but none of it made it past the static in her mind. She couldn't stop thinking about what Farrow had said last night, how certain his voice had sounded when he told her he wanted more. It had been 2 weeks since their first dinner, and somehow, everything had changed and nothing had. He hadn't touched her again. Hadn't kissed her since that night in his office. But his presence had grown heavier in her life, texting her articles he thought she'd like, showing up unannounced at her favorite bookstore, sending her dried lavender tied in silk ribbon with no note. And now she was sitting in the middle of the open floor, trying to write a pitch for a product she didn't believe in while pretending the man who owned the building wasn't consuming her thoughts like a wildfire. "Hey," her team lead said, stopping by her desk. "Farrow Marlowe wants to see you." Tessa looked up, startled.
Now.
He said, "It's urgent." She shut her laptop, heart thudding in her ribs. Okay. The walk to the private elevator felt longer than usual. This time, she didn't hesitate when the doors opened. She stepped inside alone and pressed her palm against the biometric screen the way he'd shown her yesterday. The scanner blinked green. When she arrived, the lights in his office were dimmed, the skyline glowing like a city of stars behind him. He stood at the window with his back to her, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a glass of something amber. "I didn't mean to interrupt anything," she said carefully. "You didn't," he said without turning around.
Come in.
She stepped inside and waited. He didn't move. "I heard from someone today," he finally said. "Someone I haven't spoken to in a long time." Tessa walked to the edge of the desk. "Okay. My father's lawyer." That made her pause. "He died last year. I didn't go to the funeral." She didn't know what to say to that. "He left a letter. Not for me. For her." "For who?" "My mother." Tessa waited. "She left us when I was 12. No note. No warning. Just vanished from my life like I hadn't existed. I thought he hated her. But he kept the letter locked in a safe." Farrow finally turned, his face unreadable. "He wanted me to deliver it. Are you going to?" "I don't know where she is." Her voice softened. "Do you want to?" "I don't know that either." Tessa walked toward him. "Why are you telling me this?" He looked at her, and the air shifted. "Because I can't think straight when you're not around," he said. "And I don't know what that means yet, but I know it's too real to ignore." Her breath caught. "I don't do this," he said. "I don't tell people things. I don't ask for help. But something about you makes all the walls I built start to crack." She stepped closer. "Then let them." His hand reached for her like it had been waiting for that moment for years. She didn't flinch when he touched her cheek, didn't hesitate when he pulled her into his arms. "You make me want to be someone different," he whispered. "You already are." He kissed her like he was afraid she'd disappear again. This time, she kissed him back with everything she had. When they pulled apart, he pressed his forehead to hers. "Stay tonight." She hesitated. "I just want you near me. No expectations." She nodded. He led her through a hallway she hadn't seen before, past a wall of bookshelves, a piano room, and into a bedroom that didn't look like it belonged to a man who ran empires. It was simple, quiet, a navy comforter, a leather chair in the corner, a gold-framed photograph of a coastline she didn't recognize. He handed her a t-shirt. "You can change in there." She returned barefoot, her hair loose, skin still warm from his touch. He was already in bed, reading something with a leather cover. When she slid in next to him, he closed it and turned off the lamp. For a long time, they just listened to each other breathe. Somewhere in the night, she felt his hand find hers beneath the sheets. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The next morning, she woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of water running. She followed it to the kitchen and found him barefoot, in drawstring pants and nothing else, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. "You didn't leave," he said without turning. "You didn't ask me to." He handed her a mug. "I didn't want you to." She took a sip. "What now?" He looked at her. "Now we stop pretending this is temporary." She set the mug down. "What about everyone else? The office? You're bored." "I've never cared about optics. And I'm not starting now." She raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" He crossed to her, wrapped his arms around her waist. "You think I'd let something as fragile as public opinion come between me and the only thing that's made me feel alive in years?" She leaned into him. "I don't want to be your secret. You never were." Later that day, she returned to her desk to find her name replaced on the intern roster. In its place, a formal offer letter sat in her inbox. Director of Creative Strategy, Northlight Media, reporting directly to the CEO. She blinked, stunned.
Her phone rang.
Farrow's voice on the other end.
Come upstairs.
Is this because of last night? This is because I'd be an idiot to let someone with your talent waste 6 weeks fetching coffee. She paused. You really think I can do this? I wouldn't have signed the contract if I didn't. She sat heavily in her chair. There's one condition. Of course there is. You have to stop looking at me like you're waiting for the other shoe to drop. She was quiet. I'm not going anywhere, Tessa. That night, they attended a gala together. Walked in side by side.
No hiding.
No careful distance. People stared. Whispers followed them. Farrow didn't blink. Later, during the charity auction, he leaned down and whispered, I want to build something with you. Not just a company. A life. She turned to face him. That's a dangerous thing to say. I've never been afraid of danger. He bought the final painting on auction, a stormy landscape with a single beam of light breaking through the clouds. When she asked him why, he said, because it reminded me of you. Tessa didn't answer.
She didn't need to.
The next morning, something shifted. A message arrived from a blocked number. No name, just an address. And one sentence. She's not who you think she is. Tessa stared at the screen, her chest tight. She hadn't told anyone about Farrow. Not her friends. Not her roommate. No one knew where she'd spent the night. But someone knew enough to try to scare her. Farrow was in a meeting. She didn't tell him.
Not yet.
Instead, she went to the address alone. What she found there would change everything. Tessa stood outside the brownstone, her breath catching every time the wind tugged at her coat. The building was older, its brickwork faded and ivy creeping up the sides like veins. There was no buzz panel. Just a tarnished brass knocker on a black door and a single camera above the frame. She didn't knock. She wasn't sure why she'd come. She should have told Farrow. Should have waited. But something about the message had clawed under her skin. The words hadn't felt like a bluff. Whoever sent them knew something. And if there was even a sliver of truth to the warning, she had to see for herself. A curtain moved on the 3rd floor. Tessa turned to leave. The door opened behind her. You're early, said a woman in a gray blouse and dark jeans, her voice brittle and sharp. She looked to be in her 40s, with pale skin and eyes that didn't quite match one slightly lighter than the other. Tessa froze. I didn't make an appointment. The woman tilted her head. You didn't have to. She stepped aside. Tessa hesitated, then walked in. The air smelled like dust and citrus. Books lined the hallway walls, stacked in uneven towers. A clock ticked somewhere out of sight. I'm sorry, but who are you? Tessa asked. The woman didn't answer. She walked down the narrow hallway, forcing Tessa to follow. They passed a room with black and white photographs pinned to the walls, faces crossed out in red ink. Another held a table covered in old letters, some ripped, some burned around the edges. Finally, they stopped in a room lit by a single lamp, its stained glass shade casting warped colors on the ceiling. The woman turned. You're the girl he brought to the gala. Tessa's heart thudded. You know Farrow? I knew him before he rewrote himself. How did you get my number? I didn't have to. He's predictable. You're exactly the kind of problem he'd protect. Tessa bristled. Why am I here? The woman opened a drawer and pulled out a faded photograph. She handed it over. Tessa's fingers trembled as she looked down. It was a picture of a young boy, dark hair, solemn eyes, standing beside a woman who looked exactly like Farrow. Too exact. That wasn't possible. That's his mother, the woman said. And that's me. Tessa looked up. You're his aunt, half-sister. She left when he was 12. But I didn't. I stayed. I watched from a distance while he turned his grief into empire. Why are you telling me this? The woman's lips pressed into a line. because he doesn't know the whole story. And he's falling for someone who could unravel what little piece he's managed to hold on to. I don't understand. You will, she cut in. When he tells you what happened the night she left. Tessa stepped back. You're trying to scare me. No, the woman said, voice quiet now. I'm trying to spare you. She handed Tessa a small envelope. Don't open it until you're alone. Tessa didn't take it. The woman stepped forward, forced it into her coat pocket. He'll lie. He always does. But truth has a way of finding its breath. Tessa left without another word. She didn't open the envelope until she was back in her apartment, the city lights casting long shadows across her floor. Her roommate was out for the weekend. The apartment was silent. Inside the envelope was a single page, torn from a journal. The handwriting was slanted, rushed. He didn't stop her. Just watched her walk down the hallway and close the door behind her. Didn't cry. Didn't scream. Just stood there. And that silence has followed him ever since. Tessa sat back, the paper trembling in her hands. She didn't sleep, not even when her phone rang 3 times that night. She didn't answer. The next morning, she showed up at the penthouse. The receptionist tried to stop her, but Tessa stepped into the elevator and pressed her palm to the scanner.
The doors closed.
When she arrived, Farrow was at his desk, sleeves rolled up, tie discarded. He looked up sharply when he saw her. You didn't answer, he said. Where was she going? He stilled. Your mother, Tessa said, walking toward him. Where was she going that night? His jaw locked. Why are you asking me that? Because I saw someone yesterday. Someone who says you know less than you think. He stood slowly. Who did you talk to? I want to hear it from you. He paced once, then stopped. She wasn't leaving for good. Not originally. She was going to meet someone. I don't know who. I followed her to the train station. I was 12. I didn't understand what I was seeing. She was shaking.
Pale.
She dropped her suitcase. I picked it up and handed it back. She looked at me like I was a ghost. Tessa waited. She said she'd be back in 2 days. She never came back. Did you tell your father? He already knew. He just didn't care. He called it a betrayal. Told me to forget her. Tessa stepped closer. But you didn't. I tried. But the older I got, the more I needed to understand why she left. Why she didn't say goodbye. Why she looked at me like I scared her. Tessa reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the photo. She handed it to him. He stared at it, silent. She said, you don't know the whole story.
Farrow sat down hard.
She's alive. Yes. He looked up. And she contacted you first? She said you won't tell me what really happened. He laughed once, bitter. Because I don't know what really happened. I've spent 20 years building a life out of silence. You think I haven't tried to find her? Every door I opened led to another lie. Tessa's voice softened. Then maybe it's time to stop opening them alone. He looked at her like he wanted to believe that. Later that evening, they sat on the floor of his living room, files and letters spread between them. Old newspaper clippings. Bank records. A postcard from Prague. She used to hum when she cooked, Farrow said, tracing a name on an envelope. Not a song. Just a sound. I'd stand in the doorway and try to mimic it under my breath. Tessa didn't interrupt. She was the only one who ever told me it was okay to feel things. After she left, my father trained that out of me. Told me feelings were liabilities. That men who survived were men who stayed cold. She reached for his hand. I'm not cold, he said, voice raw. Not anymore. I know. I'm terrified she'll say she never wanted me. She won't. You don't know that. I don't have to. You were a child. And a mother doesn't forget her child. He closed his eyes. The next morning, a private investigator arrived. Farrow didn't tell anyone at the office where he was going. He left Tessa in charge of a major strategy meeting. She stood at the head of the conference table confident, focused, and presented a vision that set the entire room buzzing. When it was over, she walked into his office and found a single note on his desk. "I'm going to find her. If I come back different, I hope you're still here." 3 days passed. No word. Tessa didn't sleep. She didn't go home. She waited. Then, on the 4th morning, the doors to the elevator opened. Farrow stepped out, unshaven, exhausted. But his eyes were clear. Tessa stood. "She remembered the sound," he said. "What?" "The sound I used to hum." She remembered it. She said it haunted her. Tessa crossed the room. "She didn't leave me. She was running from him." Tessa froze. She tried to go to the police. They wouldn't listen. So she disappeared. Changed names. Started over. She thought I was safer without her. Tessa reached for him. "You were never safe." He pulled her close. "I need to tell the board," he said. "The story. The truth. They'll use it against you. I don't care. I'm done living behind glass." She held his face in her hands. "Then I'll stand beside you." He looked at her like she was the only anchor he had left. And maybe in that moment she was. The boardroom was silent, but pulsing with undercurrents like static before a storm. Tessa stood just outside the glass, her hand resting lightly on the frame, watching Farrow through the tinted partition. He was seated at the head of the table, jaw set, suit darker than usual, his presence commanding without effort. 12 executives surrounded him, their expressions unreadable, their body language guarded. No press was allowed. No assistants, no external counsel. Just the core. He hadn't wavered when he asked her to attend, not as a partner, not as a support, but as the director of creative strategy. Her nameplate had been installed on her office door this morning. She hadn't had the chance to touch it yet. Inside, a woman with silver-rimmed glasses leaned forward. "So, let me understand this clearly. You're disclosing family history that could directly affect shareholder confidence without any legal pressure or PR necessity." Farrow didn't look away. "Yes. And you've chosen to make this personal history public because I'm done building a legacy on a mission." He kept his voice level. "I didn't ask for this inheritance. But I'm not going to keep pretending that the man I built this company to please wasn't also the reason I stopped speaking to my mother for 20 years. A man in a navy blazer exhaled through his nose. "We're not therapists, Farrow. We're board members." "What exactly are we meant to do with this information?" "I'm not asking you to do anything," he said. "I'm informing you. Because I don't want there to be questions when the press finds out I've reconnected with the woman my father spent a fortune trying to erase." The tension cracked like ice. "And if that press fallout hits our quarterly, I'll absorb it personally." The room shifted again. That wasn't protocol. Tessa stepped back before they could see her. Her pulse was ticking in her throat. Farrow had told her he would confront it, but she never expected him to dismantle the silence with that much precision, with that much willingness to lose. He'd said he wasn't afraid of damage, but she hadn't realized how deep his courage ran. She returned to her floor, bypassing the elevator and taking the stairs 2 at a time. Her desk was now a glass-walled office overlooking the creative bullpen. Every intern's seat had been filled, and no one was fetching coffee. She'd insisted on restructuring the internship program from day one. Real assignments. Real mentorship. The woman who once carried 2 trays of cappuccinos to the wrong floor was now overseeing one of the largest product launches of the company's fiscal year. She locked the door behind her and sat down, staring at the folder on her desk. Project Solace. The wellness brand they'd acquired last quarter was underperforming, and Farrow had thrown it to her with one sentence: "Fix it or kill it." She was going to fix it, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the woman in the brownstone. Farrow hadn't asked her what she thought of the visit. He hadn't mentioned the envelope. He'd only said, "I saw her eyes, and I knew she'd never stopped carrying the weight." She hadn't asked what he meant by that. She just sat next to him that night as he thumbed through old journals and played piano with one hand, like something inside him had finally unlocked. Now, the question wasn't whether he'd changed, but what that change made him capable of. A knock on the glass startled her. It was Helena, the VP of Brand Strategy. She opened the door. "He's asking for you." Tessa stood. "Is the meeting over?" Helena gave nothing away.
He didn't say.
Just that he needs you.
Now.
When Tessa stepped back into the boardroom, the atmosphere had shifted. The seats were empty. Only Farrow remained, standing near the windows, arms folded. His tie was gone. His cufflinks were on the table. He turned when she entered. "You stayed." "I wasn't going to disappear." "They didn't take it well." She walked to him. "Did you expect them to?" "No," he rubbed the bridge of his nose. "But I thought maybe one of them would ask something that mattered." "What did they ask?" "If I was still fit to lead." She paused. "What did you say?" "That leadership isn't performance. It's ownership." He looked at her then, really looked at her. "You've become the one thing I didn't realize I needed at the center of this storm." She didn't respond. "Say something," he said, quieter now. "Anything." "I think you were always this man. You just didn't have anyone to witness it." He exhaled, sharp and low. Before she could speak again, his phone buzzed on the table. He didn't answer. She glanced at the screen. Her chest stilled. The name was one she hadn't seen before. But Farrow's reaction told her everything. He picked up the phone and walked out of the room without a word. She didn't follow. Instead, she scanned the table and noticed something tucked beneath the glass, an envelope, addressed in sharp handwriting. She pulled it out. Inside was a document. Not legal, not financial. A birth certificate. She read the name once, then again. Her knees nearly gave out. It wasn't Farrow's name on the certificate.
It was a name she didn't know. First and last.
Different parents. She read the place of birth. Not Boston. Not even the United States. And then at the bottom, 2 initials. FM. Her breath caught. He had changed his identity. Not metaphorically. Legally. Farrow Marlowe didn't exist until 12 years ago. She was still holding the paper when he returned. She didn't look up. He saw it in her hands and stopped cold. "I was going to tell you." "Were you?" He stepped forward. "I didn't change who I was to run from the truth. I changed it to survive the consequences of someone else's lies." She stared at him. "Who were you before?" He didn't blink. "The son of a man who trafficked secrets for governments. A pawn in a family that used children like currency." "I didn't just walk away, Tessa. I disappeared." Her voice barely held together. "And you never thought I deserved to know?" "I was protecting you." "No," she said, steady now. "You were protecting the illusion that you could keep parts of yourself locked away without it bleeding into us." He stepped closer. "You're angry." "I'm terrified," she said. "Because I let myself believe you'd given me all of you. I was going to tell you. After the board. After my mother. After I was too far in to leave." His jaw clenched. She folded the paper, placed it on the table. "I don't care who you were, but I do care that you withheld it from me." Farrow looked at her like she was the one thing in the room that could destroy him. And maybe she was. "I've never had someone to lose before," he said. "I didn't know how to hold you without gripping too hard." She turned to leave. He didn't stop her.
She didn't look back.
That night, the city stormed. Rain tore across the windows of her apartment like it was trying to reach her. She sat on the floor, knees pulled to her chest, her phone dark beside her. No calls. No messages. Not from Farrow. Not from anyone. She didn't cry. She just sat in the silence, wondering if love was supposed to feel like drowning and breathing all at once. At midnight, a knock came at the door. She opened it slowly. Farrow stood there, drenched, hair soaked, eyes hollow. He held out a velvet box. She didn't move. It's not what you think. She opened it. Inside was a key. This isn't an apology, he said. It's a decision. I'm not asking you to come back. I'm asking you to open what I've kept locked. She looked at him. He stepped back, rain streaking his face. 7th floor. Storage Unit 19. My name isn't on the lease. She didn't answer. He turned and walked down the hall, leaving her soaked in something she couldn't name. The key in her palm burned like truth. And truth never stayed buried for long. Tessa stepped into the 7th floor hallway of the West Harbor Storage Building, her fingers clenched around the brass key Farrow had given her. The air smelled of concrete and faint metal polish. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting long shadows on the scuffed floor. She walked slowly, counting off the units 15, 16, 17 until she reached 19. The padlock was old but clean, the kind that required a key instead of a code. She slid it in and turned. The latch clicked. For a moment, she just stood there. Then she opened the door. A single hanging bulb lit the space. It wasn't large, maybe the size of a small bedroom, but it felt cavernous. The walls were lined with boxes, each labeled in neat black lettering. One corner held a filing cabinet. Against the back wall sat a wooden chest, the kind that looked like it belonged in some forgotten attic. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her. The silence was heavier than she expected. She moved to the first box. The label read, Zurich, Winter. Inside were photographs, all of the same woman, tall, angular, her coat buttoned to the throat. Tessa didn't recognize her. But she wasn't Farrow's mother. She opened another box. It was filled with printed surveillance reports. Names, dates, locations. None of them meant anything to her. She crossed to the filing cabinet and pulled open the top drawer. Inside were passports. At least a dozen. All with different names, different countries. But every photo was him. She stared at them. One of the names matched the birth certificate she'd seen in the boardroom. She closed the drawer and stepped back. Her breath echoed too loudly in the room. When she turned toward the chest against the wall, something in her stomach tightened. She knelt beside it and lifted the lid. Inside was a stack of notebooks. Beneath them, a velvet pouch. She opened it. A ring. But not an engagement ring, this one was older, a man's ring, heavy and engraved with a crest she didn't recognize. She turned it over. Inside, a Latin phrase was etched into the gold. She didn't know what it meant. She placed it back inside and reached for one of the notebooks. The first page was dated 10 years ago. It wasn't a journal. It was a record. Every name, every transaction, every meeting documented. Clean handwriting, crisp lines. It read like a ledger of secrets. Some of the entries were redacted with black ink. Some weren't. She flipped to a random page. Meeting in Tangier. Subject confirmed. Asset secured.
No witnesses.
Re-entry successful. She closed the book. This wasn't just a storage unit. It was a vault of everything Farrow had erased to become who he was now. Everything he hadn't trusted her with. She stood too fast and nearly knocked over a stack of folders. One fell open. A photograph slipped out. It was her. Not recent. It was from 3 months ago, before they'd met. She was walking down the sidewalk outside Northlight Media, holding a coffee tray, earbuds in, completely unaware. She dropped it. The folder was labeled, Tessa Aldrin Initial Observation. Her chest constricted. She opened the folder. Another photo, her apartment building. A line of notes underneath. Lives alone. Single. No siblings. Background, stable, minimal risk. Creative strategist profile. High potential. She backed away slowly. Every box in the room felt like it was watching her. She left the unit and locked it again, her hand trembling as she turned the key. The next time she saw Farrow, he was in the garden behind his penthouse, sleeves rolled, eyes distant. She didn't announce herself. He heard her footsteps anyway. You went. Her voice was brittle. You knew I would. He didn't turn around. I left the key because I wanted you to see the whole truth. She stepped beside him. You had files on me before we met. I had files on everyone who walked into my orbit. You watched me. I protected myself. She looked at him. From what? From needing someone who could leave. She pulled the photo from her coat. This was before the elevator. Before I even knew your name. He took it from her hand, stared at it. I saw you 6 weeks before that morning. You were presenting outside the conference room. You dropped your notepad. No one helped you. You laughed it off. But I saw your hand shaking.
She didn't speak.
I asked someone to find out who you were. I didn't intend for it to go further. But it did. He nodded once. I didn't orchestrate that elevator. That was chance. But when you stepped in, I knew who you were. I just didn't know why it felt like recognition. She stepped backward until her spine hit the stone wall. You built a file on me. And then you let me believe this all started by accident. I was afraid if I told you the truth, I'd lose whatever was forming between us. You already have. He flinched. She turned to leave. Wait.
She stopped.
I destroyed the file. She looked over her shoulder. That doesn't erase what you did.
No, he said.
But it means I'm not hiding behind it anymore. She left without another word. The next morning, a letter slid under her apartment door. It wasn't typed. It wasn't signed. It was written in Farrow's hand. I watched you before I met you. That's true. But I didn't fall in love with the girl in the photos. I fell in love with the woman who stood in front of me and refused to be impressed. Who called out my silence. Who didn't care about the numbers in my account or the height of my office. I fell in love with the woman who made me believe legacy could mean something more than survival.
She didn't respond. Not that day.
Not the next. Until Friday evening, when she walked into the gallery on West 63rd, the one she'd told him once she loved but hadn't visited in years. He was standing near a canvas, hands in the pockets of his coat. When he saw her, he didn't speak. She walked to the painting. It was new and abstract of cascading color, deep gray at the top, gold burning through at the center. She read the title, Convergence. He said nothing. I hated you this week, she said. I hated myself. I don't know if I can trust you again. I won't ask you to, he said. I'll earn it. She turned. You said you fell in love with me. I did. And now? He stepped forward. Now I choose you. Without surveillance. Without strategy. Just a man who's tired of hiding. She looked at him for a long time. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out the ring, the one from the storage unit. She held it out. What does the engraving mean? She asked. He looked down at it. It means, truth is the inheritance. She placed the ring in his palm. Then stopped burying it. He closed his fingers around it like he was holding something fragile for the first time. Tessa stepped back, her voice steady. You want me? Then meet me where I am. No more vaults. No more files. No more secrets. He nodded once. And then, for the first time since they met, he didn't try to keep her from walking away. He let her go. But he watched her like a man who had just been handed a second chance. And, this time, he wasn't going to waste it. The rain returned with no warning, pouring over the city in sheets, so heavy it blurred reflections in the glass towers above. Tessa stood beneath the awning of the gallery, coat clutched closed, watching water stream down the sidewalk where Farrow had just disappeared around the corner.
She didn't follow.
She didn't call out. She let him go. But something in her chest pulsed with a strange certainty, like the silence between them wasn't an ending, but a pause. The next morning, she unlocked her office before anyone else arrived. The city was still waking, the sky a bleached gray. She sat at her desk, opened her laptop, and stared at the blinking cursor of a document titled Legacy Campaign Draft 1. Tessa had rewritten the concept 3 times. None of it felt right. She closed the file and opened another folder, one she hadn't touched since before everything began. Inside were old mood boards, voice studies, and color treatments she'd built for an abandoned project about identity and reinvention. She'd shelved it when the client pivoted, but now, looking at it again, she felt something stir. The entire campaign had centered on the idea that truth, not image, was what created legacy. She opened a fresh document and began to write. By the time noon struck, she had a full deck and a name for the campaign in plain sight. When she presented it 3 days later, the room held a different kind of hush than usual. It wasn't skepticism. It was reverence. She ended the pitch with a single line. "We don't build trust by hiding. We build it by being seen." There were no questions, just slow nods. Her creative team rallied behind the concept without hesitation. She stepped out of the room and into her office, adrenaline still humming through her. She hadn't heard from Farrow since the night at the gallery. He hadn't come to the office, hadn't emailed, nothing. But that morning, her assistant had handed her a parcel wrapped in unmarked brown paper. Inside was a single item, a photograph taken on film, not digital. It was of her, not the surveillance photo. This one had been taken in the penthouse garden. She was sitting cross-legged on the stone edge of the fountain, her back to the camera, notebook on her lap, hair pulled into a loose knot. She looked peaceful, alone, caught unaware. On the back, written in pen, "You were never a file. You were a beginning." She didn't cry, but her fingers curled around the edges of the photograph until they trembled. That night, the doorman at her building handed her an envelope. She opened it on the elevator. Inside was a single card with an address and a time. No name, but she knew. She arrived at the address just past 8. It wasn't a restaurant, or a rooftop, or a penthouse. It was a chapel, not grand, not ornate, just old stone and stained glass that glowed from within. A man in a navy coat stood at the entrance. He opened the door for her. Inside, the air was warm, silent, lit only by candles along the aisle. She walked forward, heart thudding with every step. At the front stood Farrow. He turned when he heard her.
She stopped.
"You brought me to a church," she said. "I needed a place where I couldn't lie to you again." She didn't move. He walked toward her, slower than usual, like every step required intention. "I asked the priest to leave it empty tonight. Just us." "Why here?" "Because this is where it ends," he said. "Not us." The hiding. Tessa folded her arms. "You should have said that weeks ago." "I wasn't ready to be seen." "Not completely." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded paper. He handed it to her. She opened it slowly, bracing herself. It wasn't a confession. It was a deed to a property outside the city. She read the details. A cottage, a piece of land, her name listed under co-ownership. Her breath caught. What is this? Someplace no one owns but us. Not the company, not the board, not the weight of my name. She looked up. Why now? Because I don't want to keep loving you in the shadows of everything I've built. I want to make something that doesn't need surveillance or contracts or secrets. Tessa tried to speak, but her throat tightened. I know what I did, he said. I know what it looked like to find out you were being watched. But the moment you stepped into that elevator, the file stopped matching. I stopped reading. I started listening. She shook her head. You still should have told me. I was afraid the man I used to be would ruin the man I was trying to become. A single tear traced her cheek before she could stop it. He reached for her hand, slowly, like she could still pull away. You said once that love should feel like breath, not pressure. I didn't understand that until you walked away. She stood still as his fingers brushed hers. I'm not asking you to forget how this started, he said. I'm asking you to remember who we became. His voice faltered. I love you, Tessa. Not the woman in the presentation deck. Not the voice on the call sheets.
You.
The woman who challenges me, who sees through my silence, who stood in the storm and didn't run. Tessa looked around the empty chapel. You know what this place is called? He asked, voice shaking now. St. Bridget's. The saint of midwives and poets. Of thresholds. She smiled through the tears. He stepped closer. I'm asking you to cross this threshold with me. Not into a vow, but into a beginning. She stepped into his arms. He held her like he'd been holding his breath for months. You're sure? She whispered. I've never been more. They stood in silence, wrapped in candlelight. Later that week, the board met again. Farrow entered the room alone. He handed them each a folder. Inside was a resignation. Not from the company, but from the role of sole CEO. He was naming a co-leader. Tessa Aldrin. The board erupted. He didn't flinch. She's the future of this company, he said. And I won't stand in her way. The vote was close. But it passed. That night, back in the penthouse, Tessa stood at the window, watching the city flicker beneath them. Farrow walked up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. Still think I'm dangerous? She leaned back into him.
No, she said.
I think you're finally safe. He kissed the curve of her neck. I think we both are. Months later, when they opened the doors of the new creative retreat outside the city, the plaque above the entrance read, in plain sight, built for legacy, born from truth. And beneath it in Farrow's unmistakable script, for the woman who stepped into the wrong elevator and gave me the right life. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the cottage, casting warm streaks of light across the wooden floors. The air smelled like pine and something faintly citrus. Tessa had left lemon verbena simmering on the stove in a small pan of water. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt earned. She stood barefoot near the doorway, hair loose, mug in hand, watching the wind ripple through the fields beyond the porch. Every once in a while, the breeze would catch the edge of the wind chimes, and they'd sing gently against the hush. Farrow stepped behind her, still barefoot, shirt wrinkled from sleep, his wristwatch absent. He leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, not saying anything for a while, just watching her. You always look like you're waiting for something out there, he said finally. She didn't turn. Maybe I am. What? Proof that peace doesn't have to end. She sipped her tea. Or maybe just ear. He chuckled once, low and rough. I think we're safe from both for a while. She turned then, her expression unreadable. You really believe that? He nodded once. I do now. They'd been living at the cottage for 6 weeks. Not hiding. Not escaping. Just choosing to build something that didn't need to be defended. Farrow still split his time between the retreat and the city, but the decisions were no longer his alone. Tessa had stepped into her role with a quiet authority that surprised even her. The creative division thrived under her direction, and the press had started calling her the new visionary of Northlight. She didn't shy from it, but she didn't chase it either. After breakfast, she walked out to the garden they'd planted together. The earth was soft from last night's rain, and the scent of rosemary hung thick in the air. Farrow followed, kneeling beside her as she trimmed back the basil. Your hands are different, she said. He glanced at them. How so? They don't hold tension the way they used to. He looked at her sideways. You think I'm soft now? No, she said. I think you've finally stopped fighting ghosts. He leaned closer, brushing a bit of soil from her cheek. Only because you stood still long enough for me to catch up. Later that day, a letter arrived. Not an urgent one. No seal. No legal language. Just a simple envelope with handwriting neither of them recognized. Tessa opened it with the edge of a spoon while Farrow poured wine into 2 glasses. Inside was a photo. It was her campaign image, the one from the In Plain Sight launch, where she stood in front of a blank canvas, paint on her hands, eyes direct and unflinching. Beneath it, a handwritten note. "We saw ourselves in your story. Thank you for telling it." She passed it to Farrow without speaking. He read it, then slid it into a drawer without a word. Some affirmations didn't need to be discussed. They just needed to be received. That evening, they ate on the porch. No music, just the cicadas and the clink of silverware. Tessa wore a linen dress, her feet tucked beneath her. Farrow watched her like she was still the most unexpected thing that had ever happened to him. "I've been thinking about something," he said after a long stretch of silence. "I'm terrified," she teased. He ignored it. "There's a chapel not far from here. It's small, quiet, the kind no one really finds unless they're looking for it." She raised an eyebrow. "Planning a sudden conversion?" "No," he said. "I'm planning something else." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, square box. No velvet, no theatrics, just simplicity. Tessa froze. He didn't open it immediately. He looked at her, really looked, and for a moment the air between them stilled like the earth was holding its breath. "I knew I loved you when you asked me why I was afraid to tell the truth," he said. "And I knew I couldn't build a future without you when you didn't walk away from the answer." He opened the box. Inside was a ring. Gold. No diamond. Just a single carved line that circled the band in a continuous loop. "For every version of me you've met," he said, "and the ones I haven't become yet. Will you marry me, Tessa?" She stared at the ring, then at him. And then she smiled. Not the tentative kind. Not the practiced one. The smile that only came when the walls had crumbled and something deeper had settled in their place. "Yes." He didn't say anything, just reached for her hand and slid the ring onto her finger. Perfect fit. No ceremony. No applause. Just stillness.
And breath.
And the sound of wind moving through trees like a whispered blessing. They didn't rush the wedding. They planned it slowly, intentionally. The guest list was small. No press. No cameras. Just the people who had stood through the quiet with them. Helena from the board.
Her old roommate.
The man who ran the bookstore where Farrow had once found her reading in the corner. The photographer who had captured the In Plain Sight campaign flew in from Italy just to shoot the ceremony. They married in the chapel Farrow had mentioned, under the soft light of stained glass, barefoot on polished stone. Tessa wore a dress of ivory silk, no train, no veil. Farrow wore a black suit with sleeves rolled just enough to reveal the edge of the ring tattoo he'd gotten 3 days before. A match to hers. He cried during the vows. She didn't. She held his hand and didn't let go. Later, back at the cottage, they danced in the garden under strings of warm lights.
No dei.
Just a record player and an old jazz vinyl Farrow had found in a flea market the week before. Their first dance wasn't choreographed. It was just movement, the kind that came from knowing someone's rhythm by heart. When the last guest left, Tessa stood barefoot in the kitchen, her hair falling loose again, the ring catching the light every time she moved. Farrow leaned against the doorway, watching her. "You're staring," she said without looking up. "I'm allowed." She turned slowly. "Why me?" He crossed the room, pulled her into his arms. "Because you were the only person I couldn't control, couldn't predict, couldn't forget." She rested her head against his chest. "You were the only person I didn't want to fix." He kissed the top of her head. That night, as they lay in bed, the window opened to the sound of crickets and the occasional owl, Farrow held her close, their fingers intertwined. "I want to build more things," he said into the dark. "Not companies. Things that last." She turned toward him. "Like what?" "Like quiet mornings. And long walks. And children who know what truth feels like." She smiled against his chest. "Then let's start tomorrow." They did. They planted new tomatoes in the spring. Adopted a rescue dog who refused to sleep anywhere but between them. They built a greenhouse. She painted again. He wrote poetry he never showed anyone but her. On their 1-year anniversary, they opened a second retreat center, this one in Colorado, designed for artists and storytellers. When they found out she was pregnant, he cried again. Not out of fear,
but awe.
They didn't pick names right away. She said the baby would name itself in time. He believed her. And when the baby came quietly at dawn, with sunlight spilling across the floor of their bedroom, they didn't speak. They just held each other. And somewhere in the silence, Farrow whispered the name they'd both been waiting for. Tessa smiled. No press release. No announcement. Just love. And the life they never saw coming.